All right, hello everyone. This is a re-recording of the webinar Library Ethics 101. My name is Courtney Brown and I'm the Southeast Regional Coordinator from the Indiana State Library's Professional Development Office. I'll be the host and question moderator today. Our presenters are Chad Heck, librarian from the Pike High School Freshman Center, and Darcy Davidson Armstrong, Public Service Manager from the Eckhart Public Library. Again, due to technical issues, this is a re-record of our previous live webinar. I've compiled a list of attendee questions from that webinar, and we'll have time for Chad and Darcy to answer them at the end of the presentation. So just a reminder to register for other webinars or trainings available from the Professional Development Office. Please see the Indiana State Library's events calendar, which can be found on our website at www.in.gov/library. So without further ado, I'll turn the presentation over to Chad and Darcy.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Darcy.
And I'm Chad.
Hi, yes. To give you a brief overview, today we're going to talk about library ethics. We're going to start reviewing the ALA guiding principles, their code of ethics, and the Library Bill of Rights. We're going to talk about intellectual freedom, privacy, and confidentiality. And then we're going to talk about collection development and maintenance, access, acceptable use of internet and computers, and intellectual property. So I'm going to start reviewing with the ALA Code of Ethics. It's important to note that the ALA Code of Ethics and the Library Bill of Rights are not binding to libraries, but they are important because they codify those principles that drive our profession. Right, so they're good guiding documents that help libraries craft their own policies. So I'm going to go through these. ALA Code of Ethics. Number one, we provide the highest level of service to all library users through appropriate and usefully organized resources, equitable service policies, equitable access, and accurate, unbiased, and courteous responses to all requests. We uphold the principles of intellectual freedom and resist all efforts to censor library resources. We protect each library user's right to privacy and confidentiality with respect to information sought or received and resources consulted, borrowed, acquired, or transmitted. We respect intellectual property rights and advocate balance between the interests of information users and rights holders. We treat coworkers and other colleagues with fairness, respect fairness and good faith, and advocate conditions of employment that safeguard the rights and welfare of all employees of our institution. We do not advance private interests at the expense of library users, colleagues, or our employing institutions. We distinguish between our personal convictions and professional duties and do not allow our personal beliefs to interfere with fair representation of the aims of our institutions or the provision of access to their information resources. We strive for excellence in the profession by maintaining and enhancing our own knowledge and skills, by encouraging the professional development of coworkers, and by fostering the aspirations of potential members of the profession. And so then there's the Library Bill of Rights, which is about more about those user rights. Books and other library resources should be provided for the interest, information, and enlightenment of all people of the community the library serves. Materials should not be excluded because of the origin, background, or views of those contributing to their creation. Libraries should provide materials and information presenting all points of view on current and historical issues. Materials should not be prescribed or removed because of partisan or doctrinal disapproval. Libraries should challenge censorship in the fulfillment of their responsibility to provide information and enlightenment. Libraries should cooperate with all persons and groups concerned with resisting abridgment of free expression and free access to ideas. A person's right to use a library should not be denied or abridged because of origin, age, background, or views. Libraries, which make exhibit spaces and meeting rooms available to the public they serve, should make such facilities available on an equitable basis, regardless of the beliefs or affiliations of individuals or groups requesting their use.
I wanted to note here too that if you go to the ALA's Library Bill of Rights page, and we will have a list of resources as well and as part of this presentation, but I wanted to note this resource while we're here, that they have interpretations of the Library Bill of Rights, which are really important in understanding further about what these different points encompass.
Yeah, thank you, Chad. And those really coalesce around the ideas of intellectual freedom, privacy, and confidentiality. There are intellectual freedom and privacy toolkits available from the ALA as well. So we wanted to define those for you before we go on. Intellectual freedom is the right to seek and receive information from all points of view without restriction. It's that bedrock of democracy. And closely related to privacy and confidentiality. Privacy is that right to inquiry without scrutiny, and confidentiality is keeping that information that identifies a person private. That personally identifiable information is what links library users to the resources they're accessing, and failure to protect that causes a chilling effect on inquiry. I wanted to draw people's attention to Choose Privacy Week, which is coming up at the beginning of May. There are a lot of really great resources here for how to look at your own library privacy policies or write one if you don't have one. Look at what your practices are, how well they protect patron privacy and confidentiality, and how to educate your public on those issues.
I think that certainly in this age of Cambridge Analytica, there's certainly a programming element here where we can educate our users about social media privacy as well. I mean, certainly that's a hot issue right now. And there are tons of resources at that chooseprivacyweek.org on programming as well.
So now we're going to go on to some sample scenarios and just discuss those really quickly. Is it permissible for our school librarian to fine students for overdue library books?
I can take that one. So in school libraries, we have this home rule law, and actually a state law, and we are not allowed as a school to impose a fine on anyone that's punitive. So you can't impose a fine for overdue library books because that's a punitive fine. I've read this interpretation from both the School Boards Association as well as the Indiana State Teachers Association. Both of their lawyers have come to that conclusion that charging fines for overdue books is not permissible in schools. However, non-punitive things can be assessed. For example, assessing a lost material fee is perfectly acceptable.
Okay. A recently purchased book for the adult fiction collection features a semi-nude woman on the cover. A cataloger suggests covering the image with construction paper before putting it on the shelf in case children see the cover. That really, there's a word for altering materials from what is intended, and that's expurgation, which is considered censorship. So that would really, according to those guiding principles, not be permissible as something to do, just in case a child might see it. Speech that is not obscene cannot be restricted just because a child might see it. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later. An upset patron wants the library to restrict the checkout of R-rated DVDs to adults only. Libraries, minor checkouts of rated R or rated M materials is really a local decision. MPAA ratings are not legally binding at all. So some libraries do this differently. Some libraries restrict checkouts to minors. My library does not. So that would be a case where I would say the library should look at their policy, review that, and then talk with the patron about their decision.
The official line from the American Library Association is that the rating system itself is a tool of censorship. So their position is that ratings should not be taken into account when they are used to restrict access. But again, those things are not binding on libraries, so libraries can come to a different conclusion about what their policy is.
A concerned parent suggests moving a picture book about different families from the picture book collection to the nonfiction collection because it features same-sex parents. I'm going to say what we might do in a public library, and then I would like Chad to talk about that from a school library perspective. But I think we would review that material, but moving an item away from its intended audience is considered censorship. So I think that would be something that we would look at a case-by-case basis. And a lot of times, concerned parents or concerned patrons just want to be heard. And I'll talk more a little bit about that later. But if it is truly a nonfiction book, perhaps it belongs in the nonfiction collection. If it's just a matter of, I'm afraid a child might see this, that's something that needs to be handled a little differently.
Yeah, I would say the same answer for school library as well. One thing that I see sometimes in school libraries is that they may have, especially in elementary schools, they may have one young reader section, and then they might have a young adult section in a separate part of the library. And it's totally fine to organize your library like that as long as it's to help patrons access materials. What is certainly not following the principle of intellectual freedom and the Library Bill of Rights is telling a group of your readers or students that they're not allowed to go to a certain section of the library. And I do see that come up quite a bit in school libraries.
A class is reading the book An American Family, which tells the story of an immigrant family with a son killed in military combat fighting in the U.S. Army. The parent objects to the book being used in the classroom because it discredits our president. What is the school librarian's role?
So again, we don't want to limit access to a book because of the content of that book, especially if it follows those free speech guidelines that we talked about before. Often as the school librarian, I will have conversations with teachers and parents about these issues, and rather than removing it from the classroom reading, we look for an alternate assignment or an alternate book for the student who objects to that material. So it's better, and often it's good for the school librarian to be a part of that conversation because sometimes teachers aren't trained into finding comparable materials as well. So rather than limiting it for all students in that classroom, we just look for an alternate for the student whose family has some objection to that material being used.
And challenges will happen. If they haven't happened to you yet, don't worry, they will. This is an infographic from the American Library Association. Most challenges go unreported. These are statistics from 2016. If you saw the State of America's Libraries report that was released, they go more into intellectual freedom and challenges from last year. But they happen. They happen everywhere.
I think it's also important to note that if you do experience a challenge, to go to the ALA's Office of Intellectual Freedom page and report it. In Indiana, we had maybe a little bit more than a dozen challenges reported last year. So I know there are more than that. I've personally talked to more than a dozen people over the last year about challenges, so I know many challenges here in Indiana aren't being reported, but it's important for us to report those so that we can track these statistics and look at trends for challenges as well.
10 most challenged books in 2016 there. And then some information about where those challenges are coming from, mostly patrons and parents, sometimes boards or administrators, local governments, political and religious groups, or librarians themselves or teachers themselves. They're very often challenged because people feel they're unsuitable to an age group, or they're unsuitable to minors for all of those reasons listed in that word cloud.
I'll talk a little bit about my experience too with challenges. I've never had a formal challenge go clear through the process, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But all of my challenges as a school librarian have come from staff members within the school. I've never had a parent challenge. So certainly my experience does not follow these statistics.
And I think most of the challenges that I have received have just been someone complaining. They usually don't, file a written request for reconsideration, or then appeal, if the board decides to keep the item, appeal the decision. I've only had that happen one time since I've been a librarian, and most of those challenges come at the desk, out in the stacks by someone who is angry that something was on the shelf. And I think that might be part of the reason that a lot of those challenges go unreported, is that people aren't trained really well, that those resources are out there and that information needs to be collected. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. First, it's really important to have a great collection development policy. So the things that should go in it are the library mission and vision statements, a description of your community, a disclaimer. Is very important that having an item in the collection is not an endorsement of those ideas by the library or by the community. The collection is that scope of everything that the library selects. You need your process of selection and deselection in there, because we are professionals doing this job. It's important to communicate to the public that we're deliberative about those things, that there are criteria that we're using. And it's important to have a request for reconsideration. People need redress if they feel like there's something in there that they morally object to. It should ideally include a question about whether or not the person read or viewed or listened to the entire material, whether they think there's anything redeeming in there, and it should delineate all of those steps in their due process for requesting something be reconsidered or removed. We should strive for balance in our collection development. That means meeting current, expressed, or anticipated needs, being responsive to current events and to item requests. For example, if you're a library that refuses to buy 50 Shades of Grey, if you're a public library that refuses to buy 50 Shades of Grey, but your patrons are requesting it all the time, perhaps it's time to order that for your library. Materials cannot be prescribed or removed because of partisan or doctrinal disapproval. We have a professional obligation to meet our patron needs. It is vitally important that we educate everyone about our collection development policy and principles of intellectual freedom and privacy. Oftentimes, as I said, those people who are interacting with patrons at a public library who are opposed to materials are those frontline staff members who are not librarians. They need to know our collection development policies. They need to understand intellectual freedom, and that can really be onboarded really early. Work intellectual freedom into job interviews if you have hiring power. Put it in job descriptions if you're a manager. Train your staff how to respond to challenges, because a lot of times people just don't know what to say when they're confronted by an angry parent or an angry patron.
I'll also mention that in the school environment, administration is often going to be the first to hear about a challenge. I have been bypassed several times by the staff members who want to challenge the library material. They go right to the principal or right to the superintendent. So it's good to educate your administration as well in schools about these intellectual freedom issues and about the policy that has been put in place by your school board.
And educate your board of trustees if you're in a public library, and your friends of the library board, because the public knows who those people are. They might be approached in a grocery store, for example, and your friends of the library, as their nonprofit status, their mission is to support the library. So if they're not supporting intellectual freedom, they're not really supporting your library. And educate the public. There are a lot of really great resources. Banned Books Week is a really great time. There's a lot of information on the Banned Books Week website about how to talk to people about challenges, how to communicate that to the public. There's a lot of support for libraries going through challenges and programming ideas or display ideas.
I always take the opportunity during Banned Book Week to talk to students about intellectual freedom in a school environment. Like, it's good for them to think about these intellectual freedom issues. And usually how I start is I have a table full of banned books that have shown up on the banned book list. And I ask the students if they think they should be allowed to check those out. And of course, universally, they all say, yes, I should be allowed to check those out. Then I kind of flip the script and I start looking at books in an elementary school. I'm in a high school. And I ask them if their little brother or sister should be able to check out a book on human reproduction. And it's interesting to see how quickly they want to engage in censorship, but they don't want to be censored. So we have a discussion about that. And I've seen a lot of growth in their thinking when you flip the script on them like that, and they have to re-examine what their beliefs are regarding intellectual freedom.
I think that's really great, yeah, because it's a conversation that we should be having. I know a few times we've done banned books displays where we cover the books in brown paper and write the reason for a challenge to it, and when people see those and pick those up, they just can't believe that someone would think that the Grapes of Wrath was full of filth. And it is a great talking point for patrons. ALA Office for Intellectual Freedom has really great resources as well. Again, as Chad mentioned, report your challenges. It's important that they get those statistics, but they also offer support if you're going through a challenge. If an item is challenged, follow your policy. That's why we have them. Be deliberative. Like I said, a lot of times people want to be heard. They are owed their due process. It's important that we investigate and talk about it, and that's out in the open. Leave the item in the collection until a decision is made. And again, and we can't say this enough, report the challenge to the ALA. I bring up access for minors because a lot of times it's the fact that something is available to children or something is in a library and a child might see it or check it out that is a reason for a challenge. The U.S. Supreme Court upholds the First Amendment rights for minors. Further, speech that isn't obscene can't be suppressed just because a young person might see it. And we need to make sure that we're not using age as a barrier to information. Pulling something out of the young adult collection and putting it in the adult collection, if it is expressly for a young adult audience, is censorship. Age limits for checking out certain materials is censorship, according to the ALA guiding principles. And the library cannot act as in loco parentis. It's not the public library's job to monitor what your child is reading or accessing. That is solely the responsibility of the parents. And every child is different, and parents know their children best, which is what I often say if I am confronted by a parent who is concerned that we have a certain item in the library, that it's a parental responsibility, but it's also a parental right.
I'll also say that while teachers and school librarians can act in loco parentis for many things, the precedent has been set that they cannot act in loco parentis when selecting library materials for students. So that also is true for school librarians as well, not just public librarians.
Earlier, Chad talked about moving materials around from making sure that people can access things for their age group. We also want to talk about labeling a little bit because there's a difference between labeling as a directional aid to help your patrons find information and as a warning or to prevent somebody from checking something out, and that's called prejudicial labeling. So we need to make sure we're labeling the item and not the reader. My library recently really has changed the way we do labeling. We no longer label romance or fantasy items, partly because patrons were giving us feedback that they felt that the labels we were using were very childish and was offensive to them. We stopped labeling certain items as easy reader. Now we label them as early readers because it was you're labeling that child checking that information out as a not a great reader yet. And
there are a lot of discussions too about whether or not to label LGBTQ plus books. And I think the library consensus is, well, it's different for different libraries, certainly. So take that into account. But a lot of younger LGBTQ folks may not want to be seen with that book with that genre label on it. So a better way to do that may be to create an access list of those library materials that are LGBTQ. That's how I handle it in my library. So that there's a list of those materials to help aid access, but that sticker on the spine of the book is not going to be a barrier for students to check out that material. Another thing that happens a lot in school libraries is books are labeled with an accelerated reader level or Lexile level, and if those are used to aid access to those materials, to help users find materials that they are looking for, that's a good thing, and you can certainly use them for that purpose. But I've almost never seen those kinds of labels used that way. The way I've seen them used as a barrier to access, and teachers will say, you must read these books in this section because they have this Lexile, and that's a barrier to access, whether you shelve them that way or label them that way.
Other potential barriers to look for, look at your space, make sure you're ADA compliant, look at your formats. Do you have a lot of users? If you have a lot of users with vision issues, do you have enough large print materials, or do you have materials in e-formats or audio format? Do you charge for checking out certain materials? Cost can be quite a barrier. And before we move on to acceptable use, we have some sample scenarios. The library's internet filter is blocking anything that is tagged as hate speech, but a local organization wants access to sites promoting white supremacy. I would advocate treating this like a request for reconsideration. You must, if you're in a public library, if you use filters, you should have the ability to turn the filter off for legitimate research purposes. I would evaluate those resources that they want to access and look at potentially unblocking those. And the official position of the ALA is that internet filtering is censorship. But according to SIPA, the Children's Internet Protection Act, if internet filters, which are ostensibly optional for public libraries, are not optional if you're dependent on E-rate or other federal funds like through LSTA grants. So I would evaluate that as any other resource.
And I'll talk about this too. I think you brought up a good point about requests for reconsideration. I think it's completely appropriate to think of internet sources as part of your collection. So I would include those in my collection development policy and request for reconsideration. Schools are required to use SIPA in order to get federal funding. So something to think about with SIPA is the only things required to be blocked are pornography, child pornography, and content harmful for minors. And content harmful for minors is a local decision as to what that means. So I think that if you're following the true ALA principles, you would want less restriction to materials. Hate speech, you may have students researching hate speech in their classes. Or if you're teaching about evaluating information, you may need to go to sites that have a bias or that have some information that isn't accurate. So there are reasons to keep these sites unblocked, and the question is whether it's content harmful to minors, and that is a local decision to make.
A patron asks for help ripping CDs that were checked out of the library to their computer. That is a copyright violation. We would explain that in the public library to the patron that we would not help them do that. Would you like to elaborate on that, Chad?
Sure. It's not our role as librarians to police that behavior, but certainly we don't want to participate in that behavior. So we can't stop them from ripping CDs and materials that they're checking out from the collection, but certainly we would want to protect the library and not infringe on copyrights ourselves.
A researcher writing a book about Indiana bridges asks the local history librarian to copy the entirety of a recently acquired collection of images of historic covered bridges. I would think that that is problematic for several reasons, partly because we don't know what the provenance is for all of those images. Just because something was donated to the library doesn't mean that the library has ownership over those images. Additionally, the amount that they're asking for does not suggest fair use, which I know we'll go into detail a little bit later, but I'm going to ask Chad to elaborate on that a little more as well.
Sure. I think one thing that's important here, and you mentioned this, is if you do get a donation of images, a collection of photos, for example, you really should have the person who's donating that material elaborate on exactly what they're donating, if they are releasing the copyright to those materials, if they own the copyright to those materials, because then you can, or if they're releasing them to the public domain. So there are lots of questions that are important to ask if you do happen to acquire a collection of images, like in this example. You need to make sure you lend them in a way that is following what you can do with them as far as your copyright interest in those materials. So we're going to go over that stuff a lot more later, so I'll talk about it more then.
So internet access. Have an acceptable use policy. Treat it similarly to any other policy. Use those ALA guiding principles. Include a disclaimer that the library is not responsible for the content that can be accessed on the internet. Include a purpose statement and an introduction that it delineates what is allowed on a library computer, what is not, right? Include information about filtering. Explain why it is in there, and include a request for reconsideration for sites that are overblocked or underblocked. Text-based filtering, which we use, is incredibly unreliable. Things have gotten through that probably shouldn't have been, and I've had people researching anything from sexually transmitted diseases to Marie Curie have the filters block access to sites they were accessing for their research. So include that in there.
I think it's important to talk about how schools filter. I've been at schools that have way over filtered, and I guess that's the right of the school. This is where it's sometimes out of the library's hands, because a lot of these decisions are made outside of our library program, but it's important for us as librarians to advocate for the least restrictive environment that we can have on these technology platforms. So for many years, social media was blocked in my district, and it is not required to be blocked under SIPA. So it's our role as librarians to make sure to advocate for less blocking.
That's a good point. Also, I would suggest for public libraries to use privacy screens on their public computers. Sometimes people complain about under blocking or something that somebody else is accessing because they're offended by an image that is on their computer. Have those privacy screens for everyone. Have a process for unblocking. And make sure your staff is trained to explain those policies and procedures and knows how to access that information. And again, look at those barriers. Are you charging for computer use? Do you block computer use in a public library if they have a library fine? We recently changed our policy to allow minors to access computers regardless of their account standing, partly because our schools do e-learning and they were having trouble getting on their Google accounts to do their homework, and partly because there's a really important social component in gaming that kids at our libraries were missing out on because through no fault of their own they had massive fines that they couldn't pay. Are your computer policies age restrictive? I've heard of some libraries that don't let anyone under the age of 13 use their public computers. Children have a right to library access, materials access. I would look at all of those policies. Okay.
Okay, I can talk about intellectual property. So we're going to just barely touch on intellectual property today. It's such a huge topic, but we're just going to touch on the very basics, the things that come up the most in libraries today. The first question is, what is intellectual property? And usually in a library context, we're looking at copyright issues, but more and more I'm seeing other issues crop up in libraries as well. For example, contracted protections. We sign a lot of end user agreements when we get a license to some online service, for example. In schools, it often comes up with Netflix. And if you are a Netflix user, which most of us are, it seems, these days, you sign away your right to many of the rights that we had under copyright law. You, for example, can't have a public viewing in a school setting, even whereas before we could do an analysis to perhaps have a fair use public viewing for a video. On Netflix, you sign that right away. And on many of those online streaming services, you sign those rights away. So make sure you read those agreements that we quickly click through sometimes, especially if you have purchasing decisions on those services. Trademarks comes up every so often. It's not huge in libraries, but now that we have more and more 3D printers in libraries, I have seen a lot more patent. Actually, trademarks will come up with 3D printers as well. I've seen infringement in both trademark and patent areas with 3D printing. One of the first things that my students want to print for some reason on 3D printers is a Yoda figurine, and that, of course, is protected by trademark protection. So think about those issues in your library. But the big issue is copyright, and if we go to the next slide, we can look at the fair use analysis for when you are using copyrighted materials. There are 4 factors, and you should do this anytime you are going to use a copyrighted material in a protected way. And you can see the 4 factors on your screen. The 2 factors that the courts look at the most are the first and the fourth factor. Is it going, what are you doing with the material? What's the purpose and character of the work? And what is the impact on the market? Are you, by copying this material, are you going to affect somebody's sales? It's interesting, I just worked with a library here in Indianapolis. It was not in my district, but it was a neighboring district, and they had a project, it was an art project that used copyrighted images in a collage. So that goes to the first factor, that purpose and character of the work. Are they creating something new when they do this? And I would say, yeah, they were using this in a collage format. Also, they were using it in the school, which isn't terribly public, so it's not going to impact the market on these pictures substantially, if at all. And we determined that, sure, in the school environment, that artistic collage would be fine under fair use. You can make a strong fair use argument for that work. Well, this artwork happened to be selected for a prize. They won a prize, and they then wanted to display the work at the Indianapolis airport. And that kind of changed the nature of how this fair use argument went. It's no longer just contained within a school. It's now in a completely different setting. My hunch is it would probably still fall under fair use there, but I wasn't comfortable giving that advice to this particular librarian, or any librarian. And so I just recommended that they contact the artist whose pictures they used, and the artist was happy to have his work used in a new way and signed off on it, and it all was able to be displayed at the Indianapolis airport completely legally. So often I think people forget that if you have a copyright issue, you can just go to the copyright holder and get permission. It's sometimes the easiest way to do things. But those are the way, doing that analysis is the important thing to do for these copyright issues as they come up. Have you had any issues come up, Darcy, at your library as far as copyright?
Yeah, it's usually people wanting to copy the entirety of something, or wanting help ripping an entire audiobook or ripping CDs. And like you said, Chad, it's not up to us to police it, but we cannot aid and abet. Best practices for public libraries would train your frontline staff in what is acceptable, what is not. Post fair use, the copyright statement near copiers and computers, so people have that information. And also be mindful of programming and marketing materials, that you're not using copyrighted materials without permissions or without attribution.
You actually brought up a good point that I wanted to mention and forgot to mention. A lot of people have this misconception that you're allowed to use a certain amount of a work legally. And factor number 3 on here isn't the amount and the substantiality of the work. There isn't a magic number, though. I hear 10% a lot, that you're allowed to use up to 10% of any work, or 30 seconds I sometimes get with an audio work. You're allowed to use up to 30 seconds. Those are fiction. Someone has made those up somewhere, because that's not how the analysis is done. There isn't a magic bullet that you are allowed to use this much of a work. Some court cases have even found that if you use even a very, very small amount of the work, but it's the heart of the work, that's still infringement. So you have to think about that when you're doing this various analysis, and that's why they don't really do a lot with factor 3 anymore, and they look more at factor 4. So if you're infringing on the heart of the work, even if it's just one paragraph of a book, but it's the heart of that book, it will affect the sales of the book if people can access it freely from your copy. So that's where factor 4 comes in, and they do this analysis on the impact on the market.
Okay, I have some questions that came up during the live webinar, so we'll go through those. The first one, the Media Center staff in my corporation want to use Destiny's historical records feature, and it turned into a big deal when I wanted them to turn it off. It was hard for me to formulate an argument that they could understand. They aren't certified and were purely looking at it from a practical standpoint. Can you talk a little bit about that and maybe kind of explain what Destiny's historical records are?
Sure. Destiny is our library management system, our ILS, and historical records is just it tracks what a user has checked out. So you should definitely have some policy in place about what you want to keep and for how long you want to keep it. Many libraries don't track any historical records. As books come back in, they delete those records, or they have the system delete them automatically, because they don't want that to ever come back to that student for privacy reasons. They don't want them to be they don't want someone to be able to call in and say, did my student check out this book, or did or for even the government to come in with a warrant and ask for a patron's history for checking out. If they come in with a warrant, you have to turn over those records, even though we hold that privacy to be one of our key values. So really, it's a local decision on what to keep, and I would recommend that you keep less or not keep a long history of checkout materials. I think it's a similar thing as public libraries too. Do you have anything to talk about with record retention, Darcy, about?
Yeah, like you said, it's a local decision, or if you're in a consortium decision, but keeping the absolute bare minimum of data on circulation, holds, item requests. If we don't have it, it can't be requested. And then having the ability for patrons to opt in if they want to track their own history, that's purely at their discretion.
Great. Next question. Our new part-timer asked me if we could even check out R-rated movies to teens or kids, and I didn't have an answer for her, mostly because our kids haven't tried yet. But what is the proper answer to this?
Sure. Look at your library's policy on that. If you don't have one, it might be a good time to write one, because it will likely come up if it hasn't yet. MPAA ratings are not legally binding, and as Chad mentioned earlier, the ALA considers that censorship. It's a barrier to access based on age. At my library, we do not limit checkouts for R-rated or M-rated materials, partly for that reason that it's the library as acting as in loco parentis, but partly because it became increasingly difficult to decide which materials fit that criteria, because if libraries are circulating TV shows, episodes are rated differently. Some materials are rated R because of one line of dialogue, and some movies are rated PG at a time when a PG-13 rating didn't exist, and people might be checking things out based purely on the MPAA ratings, and it doesn't really give them content information. So what we do is we do not label anything with ratings. We do not restrict checkouts, but we do point parents to websites that explain content, like Common Sense Media is one of them, so that they have the information to make those decisions.
Great. Can you talk a bit about patron holds when discussing privacy and confidentiality?
Sure. We talked a little bit about records retention earlier, so making sure your ILS isn't maintaining that and keeping track of that data of what's getting requested or canceled. But also patron hold pickup can be kind of a dicey area, especially if libraries allow self-pickup of holds. We want to keep personally identifiable information away from what materials they're accessing. So best practices for that, as recommended by the ALA, is covering the entire item so that no part of it is visible, especially in a small town. If you have a patron's name on a spine for a holds pickup, other people can see that clearly. Another method is using a holds alias or just using barcode numbers for self-pickup of holds so patrons can find that and then no name is associated with it, or not allowing patrons to pick up their own holds at all, keeping that restricted somewhere like behind the circulation desk.
Great. What if a public library weeds an item because of condition, so it's something that's well loved, and it goes into the friend sale? Patron sees it and feels like it shouldn't be there, even though it has been in the library collection with several circulations. Does the ALA Bill of Rights or Code of Ethics protect friends groups?
I can talk a little bit about that. The ALA Bill of Rights and Code of Ethics really isn't about protection. It's more about values. So I would hope that, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, that we educate our friends groups about library values and that they hold those values as well. So I would encourage the friends group to retain that book in their sale or have some sort of reconsider. They could probably even follow the library's reconsideration policy just as a template as to whether or not that book belongs in the sale.
Okay.
I would add to that the mission of friends groups is to support the library. So it's not up to them to make what kind of amounts to a selection decision, I guess. And there are a lot of resources for how to work with friends groups and how to communicate with them about issues like this, and we'll have that in our list of resources.
Great. How do you handle a parent that asks that their child not be allowed to check out certain books from their school library?
This comes up sometimes for me, and usually it's on graphic novels. I have parents who will call and tell me that they don't want their student checking out graphic novels. And I very delicately have a conversation with them that I can't police what every student in here checks out. So I tell them to have a conversation with their child about what their family values are around reading, and just tell their student to not check out graphic novels if that's what if they want. That really hurts me that they would have that conversation, but it's a family decision. It's not a library policing decision. It's up to the family to make those rules and to enforce those rules.
Okay. So regarding making copies of materials, if it's a state document, it is acceptable, correct?
Yeah, all state documents are in the public domain. So anything that's owned by the state of Indiana or any other state, has been released to the public domain.
Okay. Our library requires parents to sign for their children to give permission for the child to be able to have internet access and or be able to check out DVDs. Is this crossing a line with limiting access?
I would argue yes. The ALA would argue yes for age barriers to materials, but again, those are local decisions, local policies, and it's good to reevaluate those every so often.
Okay. When parents sign financial responsibility for items checked out on their minor's card, should they still be exempt from knowing what is checked out on the card?
I don't think there should be exemptions for any circulating materials. When I have missing materials for the library and I send a notice to the student or to the parent, I just put a dollar total of what that is, and if I have questions, I just refer the parent to the student.
I think that's a good practice. A lot of public libraries make local decisions that they will give that information to parents if there's a fine or fee associated with it. But children have First Amendment rights, and children have privacy rights as well. But again, that's a local decision.
Okay, and I know you've covered this a couple of times, but just to clarify, we cannot legally stop a teen or child from checking out R-rated material, correct?
Legally, no, but again, it's a local decision, so check your library's policy.
Okay.
Yeah, these aren't like legal things that we're talking about. These are values. So
sure. We're not going to get arrested.
Right.
Do you have any suggestions for starting a discussion about moving picture books about trans issues from juvenile nonfiction to the picture book section?
Do you want me to take that, Darcy? Yeah. I can talk a little bit about that. I think that this goes back to the point that we had about the intended audience. So you really have to look at who the intended audience is for those picture books. Are they intended for a juvenile nonfiction audience, or are they intended for a young picture book audience? I mean, I think that they very well could belong in either place, but we shouldn't have them in one place because of a barrier to access.
Okay, and last question. How have other libraries handled the Bill Cosby children's books in their collections?
I would refer to your collection development policy, and specifically a section about deselection, weeding materials. So if those aren't being checked out, if they are damaged or worn or well loved, they can be weeded. But again, having an item in the collection is not the library's endorsement of anything about the content creator or the views contained therein. So refer to your collection development policy. And if patrons complain about having those books in the collection, that's that time to refer them, have that conversation about the collection development policy and why it exists. Yeah.
Great. So I want to thank Chad and Darcy for being with us today. If you have any questions, they do have their contact information up on the screen, so feel free to contact